Today, we're focusing on a critical topic, climate change and its impacts on the world's most vulnerable populations in Uganda. This Agnes project is supported by the Gates Foundation. Today, we are at the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development to engage 3 top government officials who are key in this project. The Granular Gender and Climate Change Vulnerability Hotspot Mapping for Decision Support in Uganda. As we know, climate change doesn't affect everyone equally. Women and marginalized groups, particularly those heavily reliant on agriculture, often face the brunt of this climate change. Today, we'll be delving into a fascinating study that was recently concluded in Uganda, aimed at generating sex-disaggregated data that enabled identification of gender and climate change vulnerability hotspots to inform gender-responsive decision-making and policy development across the various sectors of the economy. This project took a detailed look at areas most at risk from climate change impacts, focusing on the key economic sectors of agriculture, water, and energy. To help us understand this important activity, I'm thrilled to have with us a panel of 3 top government officials who are highly knowledgeable on the issues of gender and climate change. They participated in the hotspot mapping activity and will be very instrumental in utilizing the findings for policy formulation, implementation, and decision-making. Ms. Akello, can you please greet our audience on behalf of the panelists and briefly talk to us about the government's role in such matters before we delve into the gist of this discussion?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this critical conversation on gender and climate change. On behalf of my fellow panelists, I would like to extend our gratitude to the podcast host for having us today. We are thrilled to share our insights and experiences on the recently concluded study, the Granular Gender and Climate Change Vulnerability Hotspot Mapping for Decision Support in Uganda. As government officials, we recognize the disproportionate impact of climate change on vulnerable populations, particularly women and marginalized groups. Our collective goal is to utilize the findings of this study to inform policy decisions that promote gender-responsive climate action and sustainable development. The Uganda government is committed to addressing the challenges posed by climate change, and this study marks a significant milestone in our efforts to prioritize the needs of those most affected. Through this initiative, we aim to strengthen our resilience, enhance adaptive capacities, and ensure that our development pathways are inclusive, equitable, and environmentally sustainable. During this discussion, we will delve into the activities that were undertaken, key findings, implications, and recommendations emerging from this exercise. We will explore how the government plans to utilize these insights to drive policy reforms, programmatic interventions, and collaborative actions with various stakeholders.
Climate change isn't just an environmental issue. It's a threat multiplier that disrupts entire systems. For this particular hotspot mapping exercise, the 3 sectors of focus were: 1. Agriculture. The sector employs over 70% of Uganda's workforce, with about 80% being women, making agriculture the backbone of the country's food security and economy. Farming households in Uganda rely on rainfall for agricultural production, which is highly sensitive to climate change. 2. Uganda's development hinges on a robust water sector. Water is not only vital for public health, providing sanitation and safe drinking water, but it also fuels the nation's potential through energy generation and irrigation. However, climate change is inducing water scarcity, making the crucial task of water collection and management which often falls primarily on women within households, even more challenging. 3. Energy. Access to reliable and affordable energy sources is crucial for activities like food preparation, lighting, and even some agricultural processes. Access to modern energy is very low in Uganda, particularly in the rural areas where biomass like firewood and charcoal is the primary energy source. Energy infrastructure and resource availability is highly sensitive to climate change, impacting more on women who manage these household needs. Climate change poses challenges to these sectors with erratic rainfall patterns, rising temperatures, and more frequent droughts threatening agricultural yields, water security, and energy availability. This creates a ripple effect, jeopardizing food security, livelihoods, and basic household needs. The problem is further compounded by existing gender inequalities. Many Ugandan women farmers have limited access to land ownership, credit markets, and resources compared to their male counterparts. This makes it even harder for them to adapt to a changing climate and secure a sustainable livelihood. The Granular Gender and Climate Change Vulnerability Hotspot mapping for decision support in Uganda tackles these challenges head-on. Ms. Chekwoti, can you tell us about the goal of this activity and who made it possible?
This activity's goal was to create a detailed picture of areas in Uganda that are most vulnerable to climate change. And the most important factor here is that we considered not only environmental threats, but also social factors like gender, and across all the three sectors, which is energy, agriculture, and water. And it was truly a very collaborative effort. The Ugandan government collaborated with Agnes, ICRA, and Gender Impact Platform. And all these partners played key roles with support from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And by working together, we were able to provide expertise and resources to create a robust approach and a successful activity. So the methodology itself was based on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is IPCC Vulnerability Assessment Framework of 2007. And this framework considers three key factors, and one of them is exposure to climate risks, and then sensitivity of the population to those risks, and number three was the adaptive capacity. So for each of these factors, we collected data at the subnational level, meaning we looked at specific districts within Uganda, and critically we ensured this data was disaggregated by gender. So this means that we separated data for men and women, allowing us to understand how climate change impacts on each group differently.
That breakdown of project's goal and approach is very helpful. Honorable Winfred, deep dive into the activity. How did you collect all this data on these interconnected sectors?
We used a two-pronged approach, gathering information from both primary and secondary sources. Secondary data came from government agencies and existing data sets on climate, demographics, and resource availability for each sector. Once we had this rich pool of information, we analyzed it through the lenses of those three key vulnerability factors you mentioned earlier. This was the first phase of the study. Primary data collection formed the second phase of the study and served as validation process for the secondary data analysis. This involved interviews with district technical experts, mini surveys, and focus group discussions with Ugandan communities, capturing the experiences across the three sectors. In the first phase analysis, we looked at the exposure to climate risks. Here we analyzed trends in temperature, precipitation, and the frequency of wet days over time. By combining this data, we created an overall exposure index for each district, essentially revealing which areas are risk to significant climate change challenges. The second factor was sensitivity. This index considered how susceptible the sectors and communities are to those climate risks. For example, with agriculture, we used 4 key variables: the percentage of land dedicated to agriculture, the number of agricultural households, the proportion of households led by women, the percentage of female farmers in each district. The rationale behind these choices is that areas with larger agricultural footprints and a high number of women involved in farming are likely to be more sensitive to climate disruptions. Finally, we assessed the adaptive capacity. This essentially explored their ability to cope and adjust to climate stresses. Here we used proxies like gender gap in health, income, and education, access to ICT services and finance, and others. The reasoning is that with lower gaps in health, income, and education, that is, women with better health, higher incomes, more education, are typically better equipped to handle the challenges brought on by climate change. To analyze this vast amount of data, we employed a statistical technique called principal component analysis. This helped us identify patterns and assign weights to the different variables within each sub-index. Ultimately, by combining these sub-indexes, we were able to calculate a final vulnerability index for each district in Uganda. Key to note is that climate parameters, that is risk and exposure, and adaptive capacity indicators were similar for all the sectors. Sensitivity indicators were tailored to each individual sector. Here's how we approached each sector. The sector of agriculture. We analyzed trends in temperature, in precipitation, and the frequency of wet days over time to assess exposure to climate risks. For sensitivity, we looked at the percentage of land dedicated to agriculture, the number of agricultural households, and the proportion of female farmers in each district. And with the water sector, we examined data on rainfall patterns, drought frequencies, underground water levels to understand exposure to climate risk. For sensitivity, we looked at access to clean water sources, sanitation facilities, particularly in rural communities where women often bear the primary responsibility for water collection and management. In the sector of energy, we analyzed data on the availability and reliability of different energy sources, such as electricity, firewood, access and exposure to climate risks. For sensitivity, we considered the impact of climate change on energy infrastructure and how disruptions affect household activities that women typically manage, like food preparation and lighting.
Data collection is crucial, and sometimes you need to see things on the ground. You mentioned that the project incorporated elements of ground truthing. Could you tell us more about this?
Absolutely. While the secondary data provided variable insights, there is no substitute for experiencing the realities firsthand. Our teams conducted field visits, selected locations identified as hotspots in the initial analysis. For this activity, our team visited Tungamo in the western part and Bukedia in the eastern part. This allowed us to verify the collected data and gain a deeper understanding of the specific challenges faced by women, men, and other vulnerable groups in those communities. For example, during the field visits to the villages in both districts, we spoke with groups of women who described how increasingly erratic rainfall patterns were impacting their ability to grow crops in agriculture and forcing them to walk further distances to collect water. They also face the challenges of walking long distances to collect firewood, that is in the energy sector. This first-hand experience helped us understand the human cost of climate change and the importance of targeted interventions across all sectors.
So let me ask, Ms. Chekoti, you have analyzed this wealth of data. Now what?
We used GIS software, GIS which stands for Geographic Information System, to transform all this data into interactive gender climate change vulnerability hotspot maps. And these maps essentially spotlight the areas in Uganda that are most vulnerable to climate change, considering both environmental factors and the gender-specific challenges experienced by the different groups. So the results are quite revealing. The maps highlight areas where a combination of climate risks like droughts or floods coupled with limited access to resources and low decision-making power for women creates a double burden. So these are the climate vulnerability hotspots that require urgent action. So the beauty about the project is its accessibility. So these interactive maps are available online and users can zoom in on specific districts, can explore different data layers and see how various factors contribute to vulnerability in a particular location. So we had the opportunity to showcase the preliminary results of the study at the Africa Climate Summit in 2023 in Nairobi, and then in Dubai in 2023 as well. That was during the conference of the parties, which is called COP28.
This activity sounds like a transformative initiative for Ugandan communities, particularly in programming and interventions. Ms. Akelo, what kind of impact do you expect it to have?
We are optimistic that this activity will have a significant and far-reaching impact. By identifying climate vulnerability hotspots across the three sectors of agriculture, water, and energy, we can empower local communities and government agencies to take targeted action that address these interconnected challenges. For instance, these hotspots maps can inform policy and program design. Imagine government agencies using this data to prioritize areas for allocating resources and developing interventions that improve climate resilience across all three sectors.
And to Ms. Chekoti, what kind of solutions are we talking about for these hotspots?
There are several promising avenues. One key area is providing funding for adaptation and resilience initiatives in these vulnerable areas. And this could involve, first of all, in the agriculture sector, supporting projects that upgrade agricultural infrastructure, like irrigation systems, promoting drought-resistant seeds, and training women farmers in climate-smart technologies. Then, in the water sector, investing in water harvesting infrastructure is potential for expanding irrigation, improving access to clean water resources and sanitation facilities, and also empowering women through training in water management. And thirdly, in the energy sector, providing resources for communities to access and transition to renewable energy resources, also strengthening the existing energy grid and ensuring women have access to training and resources for managing energy needs within their households. And another important step is addressing the root causes of vulnerability, such as poverty and lack of access to resources. Implementing policies that promote financial inclusion for women, ensure equitable access to land ownership, and address gender inequalities across all the three sectors would be a major step forward. And finally, developing early warning systems for extreme weather events like floods and droughts is crucial. Equipping communities with timely information allows them to take preventive measures and protect their livelihoods across all the three sectors, that is agriculture, water, and energy.
To wrap up, what are some key takeaways from our discussion today? Honorable Winfred, you can wrap up, and then we have a closing remark from Ms. Akello.
Some key takeaways include the following. Climate change and gender equality are interlinked. We must recognize that climate change disproportionately affects vulnerable populations, particularly women, and address these inequalities through targeted interventions. Number 2, empowering local communities. By providing detailed vulnerability maps, we are enabling policymakers, communities, and development agencies to make informed decisions that promote resilience and sustainable development. Thirdly, multi-sector approach. The initiatives focus on agriculture, water, and energy sectors demonstrates the need for a coordinated approach to address climate change challenges. Fourthly, the issue on women's empowerment. This project prioritizes women's empowerment, recognizing their critical role in driving climate resilience and sustainable development.
I would like to reiterate Honorable Masiko's sentiment and emphasize that today's discussion has underscored the critical importance of integrating gender considerations into our climate change mitigation and adaptation strategy. The Granular Gender and Climate Change Vulnerability Hotspot Mapping Initiative is indeed a groundbreaking step towards achieving this goal. As we move forward, it is essential to ensure that our policies and programs prioritize gender-responsive climate action, using the findings of this study to inform decision-making and lead to meaningful change. Thank you.
As we wrap up, I'd like to sincerely appreciate Agnes Africa for leading this transformative gender and climate change vulnerability hotspot mapping study, and other key contributors like the CGIAR ICRAM, the UNDP Botswana, the Gates Foundation, the Gender Impact Platform, government officials and key technical experts, and the community. Your dedication is paving way for gender-responsive interventions and policies. To our audience, thank you so much for listening. If you'd like more information or to get involved, kindly visit the Agnes Africa website at agnesafrica.org. I've been your host, Angel Chalo.